The morning my life changed did not feel important at all. The sun had just crept over the eastern fence line, spilling pale light across the pasture. The cattle were quiet. The house was still. 3 years had passed since my wife died, and mornings like this had become my proof that I'd survived. I made coffee the same way every day. I fed the dog. I stood at the kitchen window and watched dust rise where the driveway curved toward the road. Peace had settled into my bones so completely that I almost trusted it. Then my phone rang. I almost let it go to voicemail. No one called early unless something was wrong, and I was tired of wrong things. When I saw my lawyer's name on the screen, I frowned. He wasn't the kind of man who called without scheduling first. "Robert," he said, his voice formal in a way I hadn't heard before. "I need you to come in today." For what I asked already, bracing myself. "There's something your wife left behind," he said. A pause, just long enough to feel deliberate. "Something you were never meant to see until now." I gripped the edge of the counter. "Left behind where? In her safe deposit box," he said. "It's a letter. She wrote it shortly before she died." I closed my eyes, expecting grief or relief or some kind of emotional release I'd been promised for years, but never received. What I didn't expect was the next thing he said. "Robert," he went on quietly, "the first line reads, 'Don't trust our sons.'" For a moment I couldn't breathe. Not because I was afraid, but because the words didn't belong in my life. They contradicted everything I thought I knew, everything I believed I had already buried. I thanked him, told him I'd be there, and hung up. The coffee burned on the stove. Outside, the cattle shifted unconcerned. And standing there alone in my kitchen, I realized something cold and heavy had just been set in motion. I thought I knew my sons. I was wrong about how badly. By the time I got in the truck, my hands had stopped shaking. Years of engineering had trained me to compartmentalize emotion until it could be dealt with properly. Feelings were for later. Facts were for now. Still, as the ranch disappeared in my rearview mirror, I felt the past pressing in, not as memory, but as accusation. 3 years. That was how long my wife had been gone. Cancer took her fast, but not fast enough to spare us the slow dismantling of the life we'd built together. After the funeral, after the casseroles stopped coming, and the phone calls tapered off, I learned how to be alone in a house meant for two. I learned the sound of silence in different rooms. I learned which drawers still smelled like her. Eventually, I learned to live again. I wasn't lonely, not exactly. I had routines. I had work around the property. I had the comfort of knowing the worst thing that could happen already had. That belief settled into me like a promise nothing could hurt like that again. And then there was the letter. As I drove toward town, my mind did what it always did when threatened. It defended. It rejected. Tried to explain away what didn't fit. She was scared, I told myself. People get scared when they're dying. Medication messes with your thoughts. Pain does strange things to perception. She didn't mean it like that. She couldn't have. Our sons were grown men. Flawed, sure, but not monsters. We'd raised them in this house, taught them right from wrong, watched them struggle and succeed in their own ways. They argued like siblings do. They made choices I didn't always understand. But betrayal. That word felt theatrical. Excessive. My wife wasn't dramatic. That was the problem. She had been the calm one, the observer. The person who noticed shifts in tone before arguments erupted, who picked up on patterns while I was busy fixing what was broken in front of me. During our marriage, she'd warned me exactly 3 times about something important. Every time she was right. That thought settled uncomfortably as I parked outside my lawyer's office. Inside, everything smelled faintly of paper and furniture polish. Familiar. Safe. He greeted me with the same measured professionalism he always used, but something in his eyes had changed. He didn't offer small talk. He didn't ask how I was holding up. Instead, he opened a folder and slid a sealed envelope across the desk. "She was very specific," he said. "She instructed us not to contact you about this unless certain conditions were met. Those conditions were met last week." I didn't touch the envelope yet. "Why now?" "Because what she was worried about is no longer hypothetical," he said carefully. That was the first time the word hypothetical entered the conversation, and it made my stomach tighten. The envelope was yellowed slightly, the edges worn. My wife's handwriting stared back at me, steady and precise, as familiar as my own name. Seeing it felt like stepping into a room I'd locked years ago. Before I opened it, I noticed something else. There were no apologies written on the outside. No expressions of love. No final sentiments meant to soften a goodbye. This wasn't a dying woman pouring out her heart. This was a woman documenting something. The letter itself was short. No rambling, no dramatics. She wrote the way she always did when she needed to be understood clearly, line by line, thought by thought, calm enough to be terrifying. She didn't accuse. She didn't rant. She explained. She wrote that once she realized time was running out, she started paying attention instead of hoping for the best. She wrote that patterns mattered more than intentions. She wrote that timing revealed character faster than crisis ever could. And then she wrote the line that lodged itself under my skin. "If you are reading this, it means I did not have time to fix what I discovered." I felt something then that I hadn't felt since the day she died. Guilt. Not loud or dramatic. Quiet. The kind that seeps in slowly and refuses to leave. I had been focused on treatments, appointments, logistics. I had been trying to save her. She had been watching everything else. There were moments referenced in the letter that I remembered only vaguely. Conversations I dismissed. Decisions that seemed small at the time. She didn't describe them in detail. She didn't need to. She trusted that I would remember once I allowed myself to look. What struck me most wasn't what she wrote, but how she wrote it. There was no panic in her words, no fear, only certainty. She wasn't guessing. She was warning. When I finished reading, the office felt smaller. "She didn't want you to confront anyone based on this alone," my lawyer said. "She wanted you to verify." Quietly. I folded the letter carefully, my hand steadier than I expected. "Did you know?" He hesitated. "I suspected she was concerned," he said. "I didn't know how serious it was until now." I stood up, suddenly aware of my age, in a way I hadn't been before. Not weakness. Perspective. "I won't confront them," I said. "Not yet." He nodded as if he'd expected nothing else. When I stepped back outside, the sky had shifted. Clouds rolled in low and gray, covering the sun without ceremony. I sat in my truck for a long moment before turning the key. My wife hadn't written that letter to turn me against our sons. She wrote it to protect me from trusting the wrong moment. As I drove home, one thought kept repeating itself, steady and unrelenting. If she noticed patterns while she was dying, what would I see now with time on my side? And for the first time since the funeral, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. The worst thing hadn't happened yet. On the drive back from my lawyer's office, my mind did what it had always done when something threatened the foundation of my life. It went straight to my sons and built a wall around them. If anyone deserved the benefit of the doubt, it was them. I had raised 2 boys in this house. I had watched them scrape their knees in the dirt out by the fence line, listen to their arguments, echo down the hallway, sat in folding chairs. At school events I barely understood, but showed up for anyway. Whatever mistakes they had made as adults, whatever distance had grown between us over the years, they were still my sons. Blood didn't erase accountability, but it demanded fairness. And fairness meant I had to start with who they were, not who a single line in a letter suggested they might be. My older son, Daniel, had always been the steady one, responsible, predictable. He was the kind of child teachers liked because he followed rules without being asked. As an adult, that translated into a career that looked good on paper and a life that never raised alarms. He lived out of state now, in a clean, efficient house that matched his personality. We talked on the phone once or twice a month, more often around holidays. Our conversations were polite, measured, and oddly formal, as if we were both careful not to say too much. Daniel liked plans. He liked clarity. When my wife was still alive, he was the one who asked about schedules and logistics. When would the next appointment be? What insurance covered? What paperwork needed to be signed? At the time, I had been grateful. Someone needed to think clearly while everything else felt like it was falling apart. Looking back, I realized how easily I had mistaken competence for care. He wasn't cold, not exactly, but he kept a distance that felt intentional. When he visited the ranch, he stayed a few days at most. He brought gifts that were useful rather than personal. Tools, gadgets, things that solved problems but didn't linger. I had told myself that was just who he was. Some people showed love by fixing things instead of talking about them. Then there was my younger son, Matthew. Matthew had always been the emotional one. The boy who asked too many questions, who needed reassurance, who wore his frustration openly. Where Daniel was reserved, Matthew was expressive. Where Daniel built walls, Matthew leaned in sometimes too hard. He called more often. He wanted updates. He wanted to know how I was feeling, not just what was happening. After my wife died, Matthew was the one who checked on me every weekend for the first few months. He'd bring groceries I didn't ask for, linger longer than necessary, sit at the kitchen table and talk about nothing just to fill the silence. At the time, I'd been grateful for his presence, even when it exhausted me. Grief makes company feel heavier than it should. Matthew struggled more than his brother. That wasn't a judgment. It was a fact we all knew. His career never quite stabilized. He talked often about opportunities that almost worked out bosses who didn't appreciate him, circumstances that never lined up the way they should have. My wife worried about him in a way she never worried about Daniel. Not because she loved him more, but because he seemed more vulnerable to disappointment. If there had been favoritism in our family, it lived in concern, not affection. Before my wife got sick, our family life had been unremarkable in the best way. Holidays were mildly chaotic. Conversations occasionally turned tense, then drifted back to safer ground. We disagreed about politics, money choices the boys made that we didn't fully understand. But nothing about our life together suggested anything darker. I remembered Thanksgiving dinners, where everyone talked over one another, where my wife rolled her eyes and told us to calm down. Birthdays celebrated without much ceremony. Arguments that burned hot and faded quickly. Ordinary, human, familiar. Which was why the idea that something fundamental had been wrong all along felt so offensive. When my wife was diagnosed, everything shifted. The house turned inward. Time narrowed. Decisions that used to feel abstract became urgent. Daniel stepped in with lists and plans. Matthew stepped in with presence and emotion. I saw balance in that division. I didn't question it. I should have. During those months, my wife and I rarely spoke about the boys together. Not in any serious way. We were focused on survival, on managing pain, on pretending the future still existed. When she did bring them up, it was usually in passing. A comment about how stressed Daniel seemed. A note about how Matthew was trying too hard. Nothing that felt like a warning. But memory has a way of changing shape once you stop protecting it. There were moments I hadn't thought about in years that began to surface as I drove home. Conversations I had half listened to. Tension I had dismissed as exhaustion. Times my wife had asked me to leave the room so she could speak privately with one of the boys. At the time, I had welcomed the break. Now, the absence felt heavier than the conversations I remembered. I pulled into the ranch just as the light began to fade. The house stood quiet against the open land, unchanged by anything that had just passed through my mind. That steadiness should have comforted me. Instead, it made me feel like an outsider in my own life. Inside, I set the letter on the kitchen table and stared at it without opening it again. I didn't need to reread it. The words were already carved into me. Don't trust our sons. I said it out loud once, testing how it sounded in the room. It echoed back wrong. Accusatory, final. I hated it. She must have been mistaken, I told myself again. Or scared. Or protecting me from something that never fully materialized. She had always been cautious. Maybe this was caution taken too far. And yet, there was one thing I couldn't dismiss. She had written the letter calmly. My wife was not a woman who panicked quietly and left cryptic messages behind. When she worried, she spoke. When she feared something, she faced it directly. The fact that she hadn't confronted me, hadn't confronted the boys, but instead prepared something to be opened later, meant she believed timing mattered more than reaction. That idea followed me into the evening. I made dinner and ate alone at the table we used to share. I washed the dishes and noticed which ones still sat where she'd last put them. I moved through the house like a man retracing steps he'd taken 1,000 times, suddenly aware that something had been walking alongside him unnoticed. By the time I went to bed, I had made a quiet decision. I would not confront either of my sons. Not with questions, not with accusations, not even with concern. Whatever my wife had seen, whatever had prompted her to write that letter, would not reveal itself under pressure. People who felt accused grew careful. People who believed they were trusted grew bold. If there was nothing to find, then the truth would settle back into place, and the letter would remain an unnecessary scar. I could live with that. But if there was something there, something hidden beneath politeness and familiarity, then it would surface on its own. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the house breathe around me. For the first time since my wife died, I wasn't mourning what I had lost. I was questioning what I still had. And that uncertainty, quiet and persistent, followed me into the dark. The second time I read my wife's letter, I noticed what I had missed the first time. I was sitting alone in my lawyer's office, the afternoon light slanting through the blinds. Dust floating lazily in the air, as if nothing important had ever happened in that room. I had already read the words once carefully, slowly, as if they might dissolve if I rushed. But it wasn't until I read them again that I understood what she had actually left me. This wasn't a goodbye. It wasn't even a warning in the way people usually mean that word. There were no accusations, no names circled in red, no pleas for justice or forgiveness. The letter didn't sound frightened or desperate or confused. It sounded like her on one of her clearest days when pain was manageable and her mind was sharp. That was what unsettled me. She wrote as if she were making notes for herself. Observations, patterns, small things she didn't want to forget. She mentioned time more than once, not in a sentimental way, but as a factor, something measurable, something people misjudged. When you realize time is limited, she wrote, you stop assuming people mean well, and you start paying attention to what they actually do. I felt a wave of guilt rise in my chest, slow and heavy. While she had been paying attention, I had been trying to stay hopeful. I had been focused on treatments, medications, appointments, anything that gave us the illusion of progress. I thought that was love. I thought that was strength. I hadn't realized that in doing so, I had stopped watching everything else. She hadn't. The letter didn't unfold in a straight line. It circled its point carefully, as if she were giving me time to catch up. She wrote about noticing changes only after she stopped trying to keep the peace, about listening when she wasn't being reassured, about patterns that repeated just often enough to feel intentional. There was one line that made my stomach tighten. I didn't understand it at first, she wrote. I only knew that the timing was wrong. Timing. That word stayed with me as I folded the letter and leaned back in my chair. My lawyer watched me carefully. She was very specific about when she wrote it, he said. Late stage, but fully lucid. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The word timing pulled me backward, whether I wanted it to or not. I remembered the hospital room in those final weeks. The steady hum of machines. The way the light always seemed too bright or too dim. Never right. I remembered sitting by her bed, holding her hand, counting breaths, without realizing I was doing it. Our sons came and went during that time. Daniel usually arrived with a purpose. He'd check in with the nurses, ask about schedules, talk quietly about insurance or logistics. He stayed composed even when his eyes were tired. Matthew arrived differently. He lingered. He talked to her, to me, to anyone who would listen. He brought stories, distractions, emotion. At the time, I thought I was watching two men cope in different ways. Now, sitting with the letter in my hands, those memories rearranged themselves. I remembered one afternoon when Daniel arrived early before I expected him. He spoke with the doctor outside the room while I sat inside pretending not to listen. I caught phrases like future planning and quality of life. When he came back in, he smiled and told me everything was fine. I hadn't questioned it. I remembered another day when Matthew stayed after visiting hours, his voice low, leaning close to my wife's bed. I'd stepped out to get coffee, grateful for the excuse. When I returned, the room felt different, quieter. My wife looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with her illness. At the time, I assumed the conversation had simply exhausted her. Now I wondered what had been said while I was gone. The letter didn't give details about those moments. It didn't need to. My wife trusted me to remember them on my own once I stopped defending the past. She wrote about a conversation that stood out to her, one where decisions were discussed as if they were already made. She didn't specify who said what. She only wrote that she noticed how easily agreement replaced discussion when she didn't interrupt. I closed my eyes and saw it clearly. A conversation in our living room months before she died. Daniel talking about simplifying things in the future. Matthew nodding along, unusually quiet. Me standing near the window, distracted by something outside, half listening, half assuming it was just talk. On paper, it had been described later as a family discussion. In reality, it had been a monologue with witnesses. I opened my eyes and looked at my lawyer. Did she ever say who she was worried about? I asked. He shook his head. No names, just instructions. That was another thing that mattered. My wife was not vague when she wanted something done. If she had known exactly what was happening, she would have written it plainly. The fact that she hadn't meant she was still gathering evidence, still testing her own conclusions, even as her time ran out. She wasn't trying to convince me. She was trying to prepare me. The last paragraph of the letter was the hardest to read. She wrote that she hoped she was wrong, that she hoped time would prove her fears unnecessary. But she also wrote that if I was reading those words, it meant she hadn't lived long enough to see the situation resolve itself. "I trust you," she wrote. Not to react, but to verify. Verify. Not confront. Not accuse. Not protect her memory at the expense of reality. I folded the letter again carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. As I left the office, the world outside felt unchanged. Cars moved through intersections. People walked past without looking at one another. Life continued indifferent to the fact that my understanding of my family had just cracked open. I drove home slowly, replaying moments I had dismissed for years. A time Daniel corrected my wife mid-sentence when she tried to explain something. A time Matthew spoke on her behalf without asking. Small things, subtle things. The kind you ignore when you believe the people involved love each other. By the time I reached the ranch, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the land. The house greeted me the same way it always did, solid and familiar. I stepped inside and stood in the quiet, listening. My wife had been listening too once. That thought settled into me with a strange sense of resolve. She hadn't written the letter to accuse our sons of something terrible. She had written it to tell me that something wasn't finished yet, that whatever she had noticed required patience to understand. I placed the letter in the drawer where I kept important documents and closed it gently. I wasn't angry. Not yet. What I felt was something colder and clearer than anger. A shift in how I looked at the past, a willingness to see patterns where I had once seen coincidence. If my wife had noticed something while she was dying, then I owed it to her and to myself to notice what came next while I was still alive. And for the first time, I understood that the letter wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of the part she hadn't been able to finish. The morning after I read the letter for the second time, I stopped thinking like a husband and started thinking like an engineer again. Emotion had its place, but facts lived on paper. If something had gone wrong, if something had been altered or nudged or quietly redirected, it would show up in ink and signatures and dates. People could lie. Documents were less forgiving. I called my lawyer and asked him to pull the entire estate file. Not a summary, not the highlights, everything. When I arrived at his office later that afternoon, the folder waiting for me was thicker than I expected. He placed it on the table between us and didn't speak right away. That alone told me this wasn't a routine review. "We'll go through this slowly," he said. "In order." I nodded. I was ready. The original will was exactly as I remembered it. Clean, balanced, equal treatment for both sons, provisions we'd discussed years before my wife got sick. Nothing surprising, nothing controversial. As I read through those pages, I felt a brief, almost embarrassing sense of relief. Maybe the letter had been unnecessary. Maybe grief had sharpened her instincts too far. Then, we moved on to the amendments. There were 2 of them, both executed during the period when my wife's illness had progressed from manageable to terminal. Both legally valid. Both subtle enough that I hadn't noticed them when they were first filed. The First Amendment adjusted the structure of asset distribution. Not dramatically. just enough to give one son earlier access to certain resources under specific conditions. Conditions that sounded reasonable on their own. Caretaking responsibilities, administrative oversight, temporary authority. Temporary is a word that can hide a lot. I don't remember approving this, I said quietly. My lawyer glanced at me. You didn't, he said. Your wife did. That stopped me. I leaned back in my chair, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I remembered. My wife had always discussed major decisions with me. Always. Especially when it came to the boys. Especially when it came to money. The idea that she would make a change like this without telling me felt wrong. When was this signed? I asked. He pointed to the date. I stared at it for a long moment. That week, my wife had been in the hospital. Not in crisis yet, but close enough that time had started to feel compressed. I remembered sleeping in a chair beside her bed, waking to the sound of nurses moving in and out. I remembered being exhausted, grateful for any moment when someone else took responsibility for something. You were listed as present, my lawyer said carefully. Not physically, but as having been informed. I felt a cold pressure settle in my chest. Informed how? There's a note, he said, turning a page. It references a family discussion. A family discussion. The phrase landed with a weight it hadn't carried before. I remembered that evening. The living room. My wife resting on the couch. Daniel talking about planning ahead, about reducing stress. About making things easier down the line. Matthew sitting quietly nodding along. I remembered thinking it was a conversation for later. Something theoretical. Something we didn't need to finalize while she was still fighting. I hadn't realized later had already been written down. That discussion, I said slowly, was not a decision. My lawyer didn't argue. I know, he said. But on paper, it became one. We continued. The Second Amendment was smaller, almost forgettable if you weren't looking for it. A change in language. A shift in authority under a specific scenario. It didn't name incapacity outright, but it leaned in that direction like a door left ajar. It favored the same son as the First Amendment. I felt a dull ache behind my eyes. Not anger yet. Confusion, disbelief. Did you question this at the time I asked? He hesitated. Yes, he said. Privately. Your wife insisted it was temporary. She said she planned to revisit it once things stabilized. Stabilized. My wife had known they wouldn't. I flipped through the rest of the file with a new kind of attention. Notes, emails, supporting documents. Most of it was routine, but there was a gap that stood out once I stopped reading generously. There was a reference to a follow-up revision that never happened. A placeholder almost. Language suggesting this structure would be corrected or clarified at a later date. That later date never came because my wife died first. Someone had benefited from that delay. I sat back, the weight of the realization settling in slowly. This wasn't a sudden act. It wasn't a last-minute decision made under duress. It was a process, incremental, quiet, built to look reasonable at every step. What happens now? I asked. That depends on you, my lawyer said. Everything here is legal. But legality isn't the same as intention. I thought of the letter. Of the way my wife had written about timing, about patterns. She didn't finish something I said. Did she? My lawyer shook his head. No, he said. She didn't get the chance. That hurt more than I expected. I gathered the documents into a neat stack, my movements deliberate. I felt strangely calm. Not reassured. Not panicked. Just clear. I want copies of everything I said, and I don't want my sons notified of this review. He nodded. I expected that. As I left the office, the late afternoon light painted the street in warm colors that didn't match how I felt inside. I drove home with the windows down, the air sharp against my face. I argued with myself the entire way. Illness changes people. Stress clouds judgment. My wife may have been pressured without realizing it. She may have been trying to protect me from conflict, from worry, from the truth. But the letter contradicted that version of her. She hadn't been confused. She hadn't been rushed. She had been methodical. When I pulled into the driveway, the ranch looked the same as it always had. Wide, open, honest. Land doesn't pretend to be something it isn't. Inside, I spread the documents out on the dining table and studied them again, alone this time. Dates, language, signatures. The story they told was subtle but consistent. Someone had spoken for me without my consent. Someone had treated my silence as approval. I realized then that I wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding. I was dealing with a strategy that relied on patience and plausible deniability. The kind of strategy that counted on me being distracted, grieving tired. The kind of strategy that assumed I wouldn't look too closely. I put the documents away carefully and locked them in the same drawer as my wife's letter. I wasn't ready to confront anyone. Not yet. Confrontation would only teach them to be more careful. Whatever had begun during my wife's illness had not ended with her death. It had simply paused. And now that I was paying attention, I had no intention of rushing the truth. If someone had been willing to wait, once they would be willing to wait again. All I had to do was let them believe I was still the man who trusted paper over instinct. The man who assumed nothing had changed. I turned off the lights and went upstairs, aware for the first time that patience could be a form of protection, and that whatever my wife had tried to fix before she died, I was now responsible for finishing. The first thing I learned when I started following the money was how long I had trusted my own silence. I had always believed that a well-built system didn't need constant supervision. That was how I'd lived my professional life, and it was how I'd set up my finances. Conservative investments, clear structures, long-term planning. Once everything was in place, I let it run. I checked statements once a year. I trusted professionals to do their jobs. I trusted my family not to interfere. Trust, I realized, was efficient. It was also exploitable. I sat at the dining table with my laptop open and a stack of printed statements beside me, the house quiet in the way it only gets when you've lived alone long enough to stop noticing the absence. I wasn't looking for theft. Not at first. Theft leaves scars. What I was looking for were fingerprints. The accounts themselves looked healthy, balanced, stable. Anyone skimming the numbers would have nodded and moved on. I almost did the same. Then I slowed down. I stopped reading totals and started reading timing. There it was. A small transfer from an investment account I rarely touched. Not large enough to raise alarms, not recent enough to feel urgent. It had been framed as a temporary reallocation, a routine adjustment designed to optimize performance. I didn't remember approving it. At first, I assumed the explanation would be boring. A clerical decision. A professional judgment call. Something done on my behalf, not to my detriment. But when I checked the date, my throat tightened. The transfer had happened during my wife's final months. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. One data point meant nothing. Patterns mattered, my wife had written. So I kept going. I opened another account, then another, side by side, line by line. What emerged wasn't dramatic. It was worse than that. There were small changes scattered across multiple accounts, all occurring within the same window of time. Slight shifts in authority. Temporary permissions granted and quietly extended. Recommendations that favored liquidity over stability, control over patience. Each change made sense on its own. Together they told a story. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Timing. The word echoed again. These weren't random decisions. They were rehearsals. Who had access to suggest these changes mattered more than who signed them? I pulled up the records that showed who had been copied on emails, who had attended meetings, who had spoken with advisors on my behalf. One name appeared more often than the other. Daniel. Not as an owner, not as a decision maker. As an intermediary. He hadn't needed authority. He had proximity. He asked questions, offered thoughts, framed ideas as concerns. Advisors listened, because that's what advisors do when someone sounds informed and involved. I didn't blame them. They had assumed he was acting with my knowledge. I checked further. Matthew's name appeared less frequently, but when it did, the language changed. Where Daniel's involvement was technical, Matthew's was emotional. Notes about my stress levels, my exhaustion, my need for support. Nothing accusatory, nothing explicit. Concern can be persuasive. I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with fear. It was recognition. I traced one particular change back to its origin. A meeting I didn't attend. A conversation I hadn't known about. The justifications cited my wife's wishes. That phrase stopped me cold. I pulled the supporting documentation and read it carefully. The wording was careful. It didn't claim she had requested the change. It implied she would have agreed with it. That was all it needed to do. I thought of the letter in the drawer upstairs, of how deliberately she had chosen her words. She would never have communicated through implication. She hated ambiguity. Someone had spoken for her. I stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the land. The ranch had never lied to me. It didn't pretend to be more or less than it was. You could see its boundaries clearly if you cared to look. I went back to the table and kept going. That was when I noticed the third name. It belonged to a financial consultant I barely remembered meeting. Not because he was forgettable, but because I had assumed he was part of the broader team. His name appeared as a secondary contact on several communications, often copied alongside Daniel. I searched his background. Nothing alarming, licensed, experienced, professional. But his interaction history told a different story. He had met with my sons more often than with me. I felt something shift inside me then. The situation cooled, sharpened. This wasn't emotional misjudgment. It wasn't a family misunderstanding. It was operational. Systems had been nudged. Conversations had been steered. Language had been chosen carefully to create a narrative in which my involvement appeared unnecessary. They hadn't taken anything outright. They were preparing to. I sat there for a long time, hands resting flat on the table, feeling the familiar urge to fix something immediately, to shut accounts down, to call lawyers, to demand explanations. I didn't. Stopping the process now would only reveal that I had noticed. And once people know they've been seen, they change their behavior. They retreat. They reframe. They deny. I needed to know how far this went. I needed to know what they believed they were entitled to. That night I slept poorly. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind wouldn't stop organizing information. It kept arranging memories next to numbers, conversations next to dates. In the morning, I made coffee and went back to the table. I reviewed email threads I had once skimmed. Noted language that assumed agreement instead of seeking it. Phrases like "as discussed" and "moving forward" used in places where no real discussion had occurred. It wasn't sloppy. It was practiced. I thought of my wife again, of how she had written that people reveal themselves when they think no one is paying attention. That afternoon, I called my lawyer and asked a simple question. Can I monitor activity without triggering notifications? Yes, he said. But you'll need to be patient. I almost laughed. Patience was the one thing I had left. I made a conscious decision then. I would not intervene yet. I would not freeze accounts or revoke access. I would let the system continue as it was, under observation. If someone believed they were acting in my best interest, they would have nothing to hide. If someone believed time was on their side, they would grow careless. I closed my laptop and pushed the papers into a neat stack. For the first time since my wife died, I felt something other than grief or nostalgia. I felt alert, awake, as if a long-suppressed instinct had finally been given permission to return. The money hadn't been stolen. It had been positioned. Whatever came next would require confidence, momentum, assumptions about my awareness and my limits. I intended to let those assumptions grow, because now I understood what my wife had seen. The danger wasn't greed. It was patience paired with entitlement. And somewhere beneath all the spreadsheets and justifications, something larger was being planned. I didn't know exactly what it was yet, but I was done pretending it didn't exist. I shut off the lights and went upstairs, leaving the table exactly as it was. A silent record of everything that had already happened, waiting for the moment when someone would decide to take the next step. And when they did, I would be ready. By the time I decided to speak to Daniel, I already knew he had crossed the line. What I didn't know was how easily he would lie once given the chance. I invited him to the ranch under the pretense of catching up. No agenda, no tension, just a father asking his son to come home for a weekend. He arrived on a Friday afternoon, his car pulling into the driveway with the same precision he applied to everything else in his life. He stepped out, looked around, and smiled in that careful way of his, as if he were evaluating whether anything had changed. Nothing had, and that I suspected made him comfortable. We sat at the kitchen table where his mother used to drink her tea in the mornings. I poured coffee. He declined sugar the way he always had. We talked about the weather, about work, about the long drive. Normal things, safe things. I let the silence stretch just enough to make him feel it. "You seem tired," he said, finally. "You doing okay out here by yourself?" It sounded like concern. It even looked like it. But it arrived a second too early, as if he had been waiting for an opening. "I manage," I said. "Some days feel heavier than others." He nodded, relieved. "That's understandable. It's a lot for one person." There it was, the frame. I didn't respond right away. I let him continue. "I've been thinking," he said, leaning forward slightly, "about how Mom would have wanted things handled. Long term." He used her name carefully. "As leverage. I know you don't like to talk about it," he went on, "but it might help to revisit some of the decisions we made back then, just to make sure everything still makes sense." We made. I took a sip of my coffee and nodded, encouraging him without agreeing. "What decisions?" I asked. He didn't hesitate. The estate planning, the temporary adjustments, the stuff we talked about when things were uncertain. I felt something cold settle into place. "We talked about options," I said. "We didn't make decisions." He smiled, a small, reassuring expression meant to calm me. "Right. That's what I mean. Options." But Mom was very clear about wanting to reduce stress for you. Very clear. That was the first lie. My wife had never been clear in the way he was suggesting. She had been cautious, conditional, always open to revision. The documents I'd reviewed proved that. The letter proved more. I said nothing. Daniel continued mistaking my silence for uncertainty. She trusted me to help, he said. I think she worried you'd be overwhelmed once she was gone. That was the second lie. My wife had worried about many things, but my ability to function without her was not one of them. She had worried about timing, about influence, about people speaking for others, about him. You remember that conversation in the living room, Daniel added, when she asked us to step in if needed. I looked at him, then really looked at him. That conversation, I said slowly, was about possibilities, not authority. He waved it off gently. Of course, I'm not saying otherwise. I'm just saying we understood her intent. We. There was no anger in his voice, no defensiveness. That was what made it unsettling. He wasn't confused. He was rehearsed. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence settle again. Daniel shifted slightly, just enough to notice the absence of reassurance. You don't remember it that way, he asked. I remember it clearly, I said. I remember not agreeing to anything. He frowned just briefly, then recovered. Well, he said, memory gets tricky during stressful times. That was the moment. Not because the lie was big, but because it was unnecessary. He could have hedged. He could have softened. Instead, he chose to undermine my recollection in favor of his own version of events. He chose authority over honesty. I didn't correct him. I didn't challenge him. I didn't reveal what I knew. Instead, I nodded. You may be right, I said. That period is blurry. Relief flickered across his face before he could stop it. He leaned forward again, confidence returning. That's all I'm saying. We made decisions based on what we thought was best, and honestly, things have gone smoothly. The accounts are stable. The structure works. Who suggested the reallocation? I asked, casually. He paused just long enough. It was a joint discussion, he said. With the advisor. That's interesting, I said, because I don't remember being part of that meeting. He smiled. You didn't need to be. We were acting on your behalf. There it was again, acting on my behalf. Authority without consent. I changed the subject after that, asked about his work, about a project he'd mentioned earlier. He talked easily, the tension dissolving now that he believed the conversation had turned in his favor. When he left later that evening, he hugged me awkwardly at the door. Try not to worry so much, he said. We've got things under control. I watched his car disappear down the driveway, the dust settling slowly behind it. I stood there for a long time after he was gone, the quiet pressing in around me. The house felt different now. Not unsafe. Revealed. Daniel hadn't come to check on me. He had come to test how much I remembered. I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table, replaying the conversation in my mind. Not what he said, but how he said it. The confidence, the assumption, the way he spoke of decisions as settled facts. He hadn't asked for permission. He hadn't sought clarity. He had lied to establish control. I wrote everything down while it was still fresh. His phrasing, his references, the invented conversation he'd used as justification. Details mattered now. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger. It was distance. The kind that forms when you finally see someone as they are not as you want them to be. Blood doesn't change character. It only obscures it until you're ready to look. Daniel had lied to me without blinking, and that told me something important. If he was willing to lie this easily, this calmly, then whatever had begun during my wife's illness hadn't ended with paperwork. It had evolved. The next step would require someone else. Someone who believed concern was a weapon. Someone who hadn't spoken yet. As I stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house, I realized something else. Daniel had crossed the line first, but he hadn't crossed it alone. The worst part wasn't the lie itself. It was how natural it had felt for him to tell it. And that told me exactly how carefully I needed to proceed next. Once Daniel left, the house felt heavier in a way I couldn't explain. Not louder, not tense, just weighted as if something invisible had settled into the corners and refused to move. I cleaned the kitchen out of habit, wiped down a table that didn't need wiping, and poured myself a drink I didn't finish. My thoughts kept drifting toward the one person I hadn't spoken to yet. Matthew. If Daniel's betrayal had been technical, Matthew's potential betrayal frightened me for a different reason. Daniel wanted control over systems. Matthew wanted control over people. And people, especially when they're tired or grieving, are easier to shape than spreadsheets. Matthew called the next morning. His timing alone made my jaw tighten. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice warm, familiar. "Just checking in. You sounded a little off last time we talked." I almost smiled. "Almost." "I'm fine," I said. "Just been thinking a lot. That makes sense?" He replied quickly. "You've been alone too much lately." There it was again, the framing. He came out to the ranch that afternoon. No announcement, no request. Just showed up, arms full of groceries I didn't ask for. He moved through the house like he belonged there, like he was already managing things. "You shouldn't be carrying all this yourself," he said, setting bags on the counter. "I worry about you." Worry can sound a lot like love if you're not listening closely. We sat in the living room where my wife used to read in the evenings. Matthew perched forward on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, studying me like a problem he was trying to solve. "Have you thought any more about getting some help?" he asked. "Help with what?" I replied. "Well," he said carefully, "just everything. The house, the land, your health. You don't bounce back the way you used to." I waited. He was building towards something. "I feel fine," I said. "Tired sometimes. That's all." He nodded, but his eyes didn't agree. "That's what worries me. People don't always notice when they're slipping." The word slipping landed wrong. "I'm not slipping," I said evenly. "I didn't say you were," he replied quickly. "I'm just saying it might be smart to plan ahead. Mom always said that." That was the second time he'd spoken for her. I said nothing. Matthew mistook my silence for vulnerability and leaned in. "I just don't want to see you struggle the way she did," he continued. "And if something happened, we'd need to be ready. Someone would need to make decisions." Someone. Decisions. I watched his hands as he spoke. They were restless, fidgeting slightly, as if his body knew he was pushing too hard before his mind caught up. "I've been managing my life for a long time," I said. "I don't need someone making decisions for me." He smiled, soft and sympathetic. "Not yet," he said. That was the moment I understood the difference between him and Daniel. Daniel believed control came from systems. Matthew believed control came from timing. Over the next few days, Matthew's concern intensified. He called more often. He stopped by unannounced. He asked questions that sounded harmless, but weren't. Had I been sleeping well? Was I eating enough? Had I missed any appointments lately? I answered simply, truthfully, giving him nothing to build on. Still, the questions kept coming. Then the third party entered the picture. It happened through a phone call I wasn't supposed to receive. A woman from a medical office introduced herself politely and asked to confirm an appointment for a cognitive assessment. I didn't schedule anything, I said. There was a pause. Papers shuffling. It was requested by your son, she said. As a precaution. As a precaution. I thanked her and hung up my hand, shaking for the first time since this had begun. That wasn't concern. That was preemptive. Matthew arrived later that day, visibly flustered. I was going to tell you, he said quickly before I could speak. I just didn't want to alarm you. Tell me what I asked. That I thought it might be good to get a baseline, he said, just in case. Doesn't mean anything. You scheduled a cognitive evaluation without asking me, I said. He frowned. Dad, you're taking this the wrong way. The phrase hit me like a slap. I'm capable, I said quietly. I know, he replied. But capability can change. That was the line. Not because it was cruel, but because it was calculated. I saw then what my wife must have seen in her final months, the way concern could be weaponized, the way pressure could be applied gently, persistently, until resistance looked unreasonable. Memory pulled me backward without warning. I saw my wife in her hospital bed, thinner than she should have been, her eyes alert even when her body failed her. I remembered stepping out of the room one evening because Matthew had asked to speak with her privately. I remembered how tired she looked when I returned. At the time, I had assumed she was simply exhausted. Now, I wondered what he had asked of her, what he had suggested, what pressure he might have applied under the guise of care. I dismissed the appointment. Matthew didn't take it well. You're being stubborn, he said, his voice tight. This is exactly why we need to think ahead. That word again. I'm thinking, just fine, I said. And I'm done discussing this. He stared at me, searching my face, recalibrating. For the first time, I saw frustration flash through the concern. You don't have to do this alone, he said, his tone shifting. Let us help. Help is only help when it's asked for. After he left, I sat alone in the quiet house, the weight of what had just happened settling over me. Daniel had lied to gain control over assets. Matthew was willing to question my autonomy to gain control over me. The difference mattered. Daniel wanted access. Matthew wanted authority. And authority over a person is far more dangerous than authority over money. That night I made another decision. I would not confront Matthew yet. Not openly, not directly. He believed concern gave him moral cover. Exposing him too soon would only drive his tactics underground. I needed him to believe his approach was working. The next time he called, I sounded tired, uncertain. I asked questions I already knew the answers to. I let him explain things slowly, patiently, as if teaching me something new. I felt something inside me harden as I listened. This was no longer about misunderstanding. It was about control, disguised as care. As I hung up the phone, I thought of my wife's letter again, of the calm in her words, of the restraint. She hadn't written in anger because she hadn't needed to. She had seen the escalation coming. Daniel had tested the ground. Matthew was preparing to take it. And now, with both of them revealing their hands in different ways, I understood the full shape of the danger she had tried to warn me about. It wasn't one betrayal. It was a sequence. And the next move had to be mine. I stopped thinking about what they had done and started thinking about what they believed they could do next. That was the shift. The moment everything clarified. Knowledge alone wasn't enough anymore. I didn't need more suspicion. I didn't need reassurance. I needed certainty that would survive denial, excuses, and revision. If I was going to act, I had to act once cleanly and in a way that left no room for interpretation. This wasn't about punishing my sons. It was about protecting myself. I began by defining the rules quietly in my own mind. I would not lie. I would not exaggerate. I would not provoke them into saying something reckless and then pretend it meant more than it did. I would let them move on their own, at their own pace, toward whatever conclusion they believed was inevitable. All I had to do was make them comfortable. The first call I made was to my lawyer. I didn't tell him everything at once. I didn't need to. I told him I was concerned about influence, about assumptions being made, without my consent, about boundaries that were beginning to blur. He listened carefully, the way professionals do when they already suspect the answer. "You don't need confrontation yet," he said. "You need documentation." That word again. Documentation. I met with him in person 2 days later. This time we spoke plainly. I laid out what I knew, the will amendments, the financial patterns, Daniel's invented conversations, Matthew's preemptive medical maneuvering. My lawyer didn't interrupt. He didn't react. He simply nodded and took notes. When I finished, he closed his folder and looked at me steadily. "This isn't confusion," he said. "It's positioning." I felt no satisfaction hearing that. Only resolve. We brought in a financial compliance specialist next. Someone who understood systems well enough to see how they were nudged without appearing disturbed. She reviewed the accounts, the permissions, the communication logs. Her conclusions matched my own. "They're not taking," she said. "They're preparing." Finally, I consulted a medical ethics advisor. Not to accuse, to understand boundaries. What could be requested? What required consent? What crossed the line from care into coercion? I didn't need her outrage. I needed her clarity. By the end of that week, I had what I needed. Not proof yet, but a framework, a map of how this kind of thing unfolded when no one stopped it early. Then I changed my behavior. Not dramatically, not clumsily, just enough. I started asking questions I'd never asked before. Simple ones. About processes, about reminders, about whether things were getting harder than they used to be. I mentioned being tired more often. I admitted once or twice that managing everything alone felt heavier lately. I didn't fake weakness. I suggested vulnerability. The effect was immediate. Daniel responded first exactly as I expected. He sent emails, suggestions, articles about streamlining responsibilities. He framed everything as efficiency, risk management, forward thinking. He never used emotional language. He didn't need to. Matthew reacted differently. He called more often. His voice softened. He spoke slowly, carefully, like someone explaining something to a child. "You don't have to do this all yourself," he said. "We're family." Family. That word had never sounded so conditional. I fed them information selectively. Nothing false. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to give them something to work with. I mentioned thinking about simplifying finances. Wondered aloud what would happen if I traveled less. Asked what kind of support existed if someone needed help managing property in the future. I watched carefully. Daniel moved toward structure. He suggested reallocations, timelines, contingencies. Matthew moved toward authority. He suggested evaluations, check-ins, oversight. They weren't coordinating anymore. They were competing. That was important. People who believe they're in control tend to get careless. People who believe they're racing against time get sloppy. I documented everything. Emails were saved, messages archived, notes taken immediately after conversations, while tone and phrasing were still fresh. I didn't editorialize. I didn't interpret. I recorded exactly what was said, exactly how it was framed. The shift came quietly. Daniel proposed revisiting power of attorney arrangements. He framed it as temporary, sensible, a safety net. Matthew suggested a second medical opinion, not because something was wrong, he said, but because it couldn't hurt. Neither asked if I wanted these things. They assumed I would agree. That assumption was the confirmation I needed. I delayed responding. Not too long, just enough. I asked for clarification, requested more information, expressed mild confusion. I let them explain things twice, 3 times, watching their patience thin with each repetition. The more they explained, the more they revealed. Daniel's language grew sharper, more transactional. Matthew's grew softer, more paternal. Both believed they were doing the right thing. Both believed the outcome was already decided. Late one evening, I sat alone in the living room, the house dark except for a single lamp. The quiet felt different now. Not empty, intentional. I thought of my wife sitting in that same chair listening, watching, choosing restraint over reaction. She had known something I was only now beginning to understand. The most dangerous people aren't cruel. They're confident. They believe their intentions justify their actions. They believe concern excuses overreach. They believe patience entitles them to reward. I wasn't angry at my sons in that moment. I was clear. Clear about what they had chosen. Clear about what they believed they were owed. Clear about what I had to do next. The trap wasn't about catching them in a lie. It was about letting them step fully into their assumptions. And once they did, once they acted as if my consent was irrelevant, the truth would speak louder than anything I could ever say. I went upstairs and placed my wife's letter on the nightstand. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. She had warned me not to trust our sons. She had never said I couldn't outthink them. As I turned off the light, one final thought settled into place, steady and unshakable. The next move would be public. And once it happened, there would be no going back. They stopped asking for my opinion. Somewhere between the 3rd unanswered email and the 2nd postponed phone call. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. Control doesn't arrive announcing itself. It creeps in quiet and confident, the way people do when they believe the outcome is already decided. Daniel's messages shifted first. Where he once framed ideas as suggestions, he began speaking in conclusions. Phrases like moving forward and the next step appeared without context, as if agreement had already been reached. He copied me on emails after the fact, not before. He referenced timelines I hadn't approved. Matthew followed with concern that had lost its softness. "You sounded confused earlier," he said one evening, his voice carefully steady. "That's not like you." "I was tired," I replied. "Tired people make mistakes," he said gently. "That's why support matters." Support. The word hovered between us, heavy with implication. The first open overstep arrived disguised as efficiency. I learned about it through a voicemail from a firm I didn't recognize thanking me for authorizing a preliminary review of my accounts. No signatures had been requested, no confirmation sought. Just a polite assumption that everything was in motion. I called Daniel. "What review?" I asked. There was a pause, a small one, measured. "It's nothing serious," he said. "Just a standard assessment. We talked about it." "We did not. I don't remember agreeing to anything I said." "That's because it's preliminary," he replied smoothly. It doesn't require action on your part yet. Yet. I hung up without responding, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I did. And saying it would stop the momentum I needed to understand. Instead, I let the illusion hold. I began asking neutral questions. Who was involved? What the scope was? How long it would take? I sounded uncertain, even grateful. I let them explain things slowly, patiently, the way people do when they believe they're guiding someone toward an inevitable conclusion. Behind the scenes, their dynamic changed. Daniel and Matthew stopped aligning their language. One pushed for speed, the other for justification. One emphasized numbers, the other narratives. I caught glimpses of irritation when they thought I wasn't paying attention. They were no longer coordinating. They were competing. The moment they stopped seeking my consent came quietly. A document arrived in my inbox late one night. Draft language. Neutral. Professional. It referenced my anticipated needs and outlined authority transfers in the event of diminished capacity. The word diminished sat there understated and lethal. My signature was mentioned, not requested. Mentioned. I stared at the screen for a long time, my reflection faintly visible in the dark glass. I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity settle in like a final piece clicking into place. This was what my wife had seen. I thought back to our years together, to how often she had told me that people reveal themselves when they think the work is done. When they stop persuading and start assuming. They believed I was failing. They believed time was on their side. The next day, I tested them. Not directly. I never needed to. I brought up a hypothetical during a call with Matthew, my voice deliberately uncertain. "I've been thinking," I said. "What if I sold part of the land, just to simplify things?" He reacted instantly. "That wouldn't be wise," he said. "Not right now. Why not? It could complicate things," he replied. "Especially with everything else we're setting up." Setting up. I made a similar comment to Daniel later that afternoon, framed differently. "If I changed beneficiaries," I said casually, "would that disrupt the structure?" His response was sharper. "It would," he said. "It would create unnecessary instability." Instability. Two reactions, same urgency, different masks. That was enough. I locked in the evidence that night. Archived messages, saved drafts, logged calls. Not just what was said, but when. Not just actions, but assumptions. Patterns were undeniable now. My lawyer confirmed what I already knew. "They've crossed the threshold," he said. "The next step is exposure." I didn't rush it. Exposure needed witnesses. In the days that followed, I let them believe the pressure was working. I asked for clarifications again, expressed mild confusion, thanked them for their patience. I watched their tone shift from reassurance to irritation. Daniel grew curt. Matthew grew insistent. Neither realized that every word was being recorded, every assumption documented. The night before everything changed, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the same place where Daniel had lied to my face, and Matthew had offered to manage my life. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt resolved. I thought about the difference between weakness and restraint. Weakness collapses under pressure. Restraint allows pressure to reveal truth. They had mistaken my silence for surrender. They were wrong. When I went to bed, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Not because I felt safe, but because I felt prepared. The next chapter of this story would not unfold in whispers or drafts or assumptions. It would happen in a room with witnesses. And when it did, the narrative they had been building would collapse under its own confidence. They thought I was weak. They were about to learn that I had simply been waiting. The meeting took place in the one room they never expected me to choose. Not a lawyer's office, not a conference room, my dining room. The long oak table had been part of this house longer than any of us. It had held birthdays, arguments, quiet breakfasts, and my wife's last Christmas dinner. It was a place of family, not authority. That was precisely why I chose it. Daniel arrived, first briefcase in hand, expression composed. He looked around as if assessing whether this was formal or symbolic, then took a seat without asking. Matthew followed 10 minutes later, concern written carefully across his face, his eyes scanning me for signs of weakness. Neither asked why my lawyer was already there. Neither asked why a second attorney they didn't recognize sat quietly at the far end of the table. I waited until everyone was seated before I spoke. "Thank you for coming," I said. "I won't keep this long." Daniel nodded. Matthew leaned forward. "Dad," Matthew began, "are you feeling okay? You sounded urgent on the phone." "I'm fine," I said. "That's part of why we're here." I slid a single folder across the table. Not thick, not dramatic, just enough. "This is a timeline," I continued, "of decisions made on my behalf over the last 3 years. Daniel's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Matthew glanced at the folder, then back at me. "What is this?" "It's documentation," my lawyer said calmly. "Emails, drafts, meeting notes, authorizations implied but not granted." Daniel opened the folder despite himself. Matthew did not. "You didn't need to do this," Matthew said quickly. "We were just trying to help." "Help?" I held his gaze. "I know." That seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. I let the silence stretch. Daniel cleared his throat. "If there are concerns," he said, "we can address them rationally." "Good," I replied. "Then let's start with this." I nodded to my lawyer, who slid a printed email across the table toward Daniel. He read it once, then again. His face remained controlled, but his hand tightened around the paper. That email, my lawyer said, references authority that was never granted. Daniel looked up. It was a draft. And yet actions followed, the other attorney added, based on the assumptions in that draft. Matthew finally opened the folder. His eyes moved quickly, scanning, searching for context that wasn't there. "This looks out of order," he said. "Dad, you're misinterpreting." "No," I said quietly. "I'm not." I placed my wife's letter on the table. Neither of them touched it. "She wrote this 3 years ago," I continued. "When she was dying. She told me not to trust you." Matthew flinched. Daniel went still. "She didn't accuse," I said. "She didn't name names. She told me to watch patterns." I looked at them, one at a time. I watched. Daniel spoke first. "She was sick," he said carefully. "She may have misunderstood." "She was clearer than I was," I replied. "That's why she wrote it." Matthew leaned forward, desperation creeping into his voice. "Dad, we never meant to hurt you." "I believe you," I said. "That's the problem." The room fell silent. "You believed you knew better," I continued. "You believed time entitled you to act. You believed concern justified control." Daniel closed the folder slowly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this ends now," I replied. "Today." My lawyer slid another document across the table. This one heavier. "Final. All permissions have been revoked," he said. "All third-party access terminated. A new structure is in place." Matthew's voice cracked. "You can't do this without talking to us." I looked at him gently. I just did. Daniel leaned back, calculation flashing across his face. And if we contest this, the other attorney spoke for the first time. Then we proceed with formal review, including evidence of undue influence and unauthorized action. Daniel's confidence wavered. Matthew looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. You planned this? Yes, I said. Carefully, the silence that followed was different from the ones before. This one had weight, finality. I loved your mother, I said. She trusted me to finish what she couldn't. Matthew stood abruptly. This is a mistake. No, I replied. It's a boundary. Daniel remained seated, his expression tight. What happens now? Now, I said you step back. I stood signaling the end of the meeting. They left without another word. When the door closed behind them, the house exhaled. My lawyer gathered his papers. You did well, he said. I nodded, but I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. That night I sat alone at the dining table, my wife's letter folded neatly beside me. The house was quiet again, but the weight was gone. For the first time since she died, I felt her presence not as absence, but as guidance fulfilled. She had warned me. I had listened. And nothing they could do now would ever take that away. The fallout didn't arrive loudly. There were no slammed doors, no shouting matches, no dramatic phone calls in the middle of the night. What followed the meeting was quieter and, in many ways, more revealing. Silence has a way of showing you what noise used to hide. For the first week, neither of my sons contacted me. I expected anger. I expected arguments framed as concern appeals to family, to history, to everything we had been before this moment. Instead, there was nothing. The absence felt deliberate, as if they were recalculating, waiting to see if I would blink. I didn't. Life at the ranch returned to a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. I woke early, made coffee, walked the perimeter of the property, just as I used to. The land looked the same, but I didn't. Something in me had settled, not hardened, clarified. The first sign of resistance came through my lawyer. Daniel had requested copies of the revised documents, not to challenge them, but to review the changes. The phrasing was careful, almost respectful. It was the tone of someone deciding whether escalation was worth the cost. Matthew's response was different. He showed up at the ranch unannounced one afternoon, his car kicking up dust at the end of the drive. I watched from the porch as he stepped out, his posture uncertain for the first time I could remember. Dad, he said, stopping a few feet away. We need to talk. I didn't invite him inside. We already did, I said. He swallowed. You humiliated us. I considered that for a moment. No, I replied. I stopped you. That's not the same, he said, frustration cracking through his voice. People already thought I interrupted. That's why this had to be done the way it was. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing slightly. You didn't even give us a chance to explain. I gave you years, I said quietly. That stopped him. For a moment the concern slipped, and what remained was something raw, not cruelty. Resentment. The kind that grows when entitlement meets resistance. You always trusted us, he said. Why not now? I looked at him and saw my son, yes. But I also saw a man who had tried to make decisions for me without my consent, and then convinced himself it was love. I trusted you to respect my boundaries, I said. You didn't. He left shortly after that, anger simmering beneath the surface, unresolved. The weeks that followed were marked by distance. Daniel maintained a professional silence, communicating only through legal channels. Matthew oscillated between brief messages and long gaps, as if unsure which version of himself to present. I didn't reach out. Grief has a way of teaching you that not every relationship can be saved by effort alone. Some require honesty. Others require separation. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table with my wife's letter open in front of me for the first time in weeks. I read it slowly, not for instruction this time, but for reassurance. The calm in her words still amazed me. She had known this would hurt. She had also known it would be necessary. A month after the meeting, the formal notice arrived. Daniel had decided not to contest the new structure. The language was neutral, the subtext clear. The cost of fighting outweighed the potential gain. Control had slipped beyond reach. Matthew took longer. He sent a message one night that I didn't respond to right away. "I don't know who you are anymore," it read. I stared at the words for a long time before setting the phone down. I knew exactly who I was. I was a man who had outlived his wife and learned too late how closely love and vigilance can sit beside each other. I was someone who had mistaken peace for safety, someone who had finally understood that boundaries are not punishments but protections. Eventually, Matthew stopped writing. The house grew quieter, but not emptier. I spent more time in the garden, tending the roses my wife had planted years ago. I fixed things around the ranch that had been neglected not because they were broken, but because they reminded me that maintenance matters. You don't wait for collapse to act. Friends checked in, neighbors stopped by. Life moved forward slower, but steadier. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the land, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't feel guilty. I had expected guilt to linger to haunt the edges of my decisions. Instead, there was only sadness. And sadness I could live with. Sadness honors what was real without pretending it was perfect. The letter went back into its envelope that night. Not because I wanted to forget it, but because I no longer needed it as armor. My wife had trusted me to see clearly when I was ready. I had done that. And though the cost was high, the alternative would have cost me far more. Family is not defined by proximity or blood alone. It is defined by respect, by the willingness to listen when someone says no, by understanding that love does not grant ownership. That lesson came late to my sons. It came just in time for me. As the house settled into evening, I turned off the lights and stood for a moment in the quiet, aware that the chapter we had all avoided was finally closed. What came next would be simpler, not easier, but honest. And that I had learned was the only foundation strong enough to build anything lasting. 3 months after the meeting, I finally visited the bank vault alone. The same one my lawyer had opened years earlier, back when my wife still had the strength to walk beside me and joke about how dramatic safe deposit boxes always felt in movies. The room smelled faintly of metal and paper, unchanged by time or grief. I signed my name, accepted the small numbered box, and carried it to the table with a steadiness I hadn't felt then. Inside were documents I already knew by heart now. Updated trusts, letters of instruction, a few photographs I hadn't seen in years. At the very bottom, wrapped carefully in a plain envelope, was my wife's handwriting again. Not a warning this time, a reflection. She had written it during her last weeks after the letter that changed everything. It wasn't meant to be opened at any specific moment. "Just when you feel settled," she had written in the corner. I opened it slowly. She wrote about love without romance, about partnership without illusion, about how becoming a parent doesn't end when your children grow up, but it does change. She wrote that one of the hardest lessons she had learned was that protection sometimes looks like distance, and that clarity often arrives only after something breaks. I hope she wrote that if you ever have to choose between being liked and being clear, you choose clarity. Our children will survive disappointment. What they may not survive is being allowed to mistake entitlement for love. I folded the letter and sat there for a long time. That afternoon, I drove home through roads I had traveled thousands of times before. The ranch appeared on the horizon the way it always had, wide and open, unchanged by the private battles that had been fought within its walls. Life had not returned to what it was before. It had become something quieter. Daniel sent a message eventually. Not an apology, not an accusation, just an update about his work framed neutrally, cautiously. I replied politely, briefly. That was enough. Matthew remained silent. I didn't chase the silence away. Silence, I had learned, can be a boundary just as firm as any document. I spent more evenings outside now, sitting on the porch, as the sun dropped behind the land my wife had loved so fiercely. I planted new roses where some had failed, and I let others grow wild. Not everything needs correction to be beautiful. One night, as the air cooled and the sky darkened, I thought about the years I had spent believing peace meant safety. I thought about how easily I had mistaken quiet for harmony, and how reluctant I had been to question that illusion, because questioning it meant risking loss. Loss came anyway. It always does. The difference is whether it arrives by accident or by choice. I had chosen clarity. I had chosen to finish what my wife began, not out of anger or revenge, but out of respect for truth. That I realized was the part people misunderstand most about stories like mine. This was never about punishment. It was about dignity. Mine, hers. Even my sons, whether they understood that yet or not. Family drama doesn't always end with reconciliation. Sometimes it ends with acceptance, with the understanding that love can exist without access and care can exist without control. I don't regret what I did. I regret only that it took me so long to listen. If you're hearing this, and something in your chest feels tight, if you've ever ignored a quiet warning because it threatened the picture you wanted to believe in, you're not alone. Most of us don't want to see betrayal when it wears a familiar face. But paying attention doesn't make you cold. It makes you honest. And honesty, even when it costs you, is always cheaper than the alternative. If this story made you think of someone or reminded you of a moment you almost dismissed, I'd like to hear about it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your experience might be the clarity someone else needs right now. And if you believe that protecting yourself, setting boundaries, and choosing truth over comfort are worth talking about, stay with me. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't loud. It's living clearly long after the truth has finally been spoken.